In the year 1958, from one of the storehouses, 4,000 Sony TR-63 receivers were suddenly stolen. That warehouse was packed with receivers from other brands, but the thieves took only Sony because Sony receivers outperformed all other brands by a mile. This robbery made headlines on the radio, and the New York Times described it as the largest radio receiver theft in history. At that time, the burglary was almost the only topic of conversation. Although it caused damage worth $100,000, everything coincided so well that the name Sony echoed throughout America and was on everyone's lips. And in the end, this whole situation made such an impression that a whopping 500,000 receivers were sold in just 2 years. Before the war, the reputation of Japanese goods abroad was associated with all sorts of junk, cheap trinkets and baubles. The inscription "Made in Japan" was printed in microscopic font to avoid embarrassment. But now, stores across America were eager to sell Sony receivers. The history of Sony dates back to ancient times. When the Americans suddenly dropped an atomic bomb on Japan in 1945, thousands of people instantly turned into charred remains, and the place became a burnt desert and charred ruins. It was then that the Japanese were really shocked and scared. But there was one military engineer, Akio Morita, who was still optimistic. He shouted to his fellow soldiers, "The Americans are 10 times better than us. There is no point in continuing to research and invent for military purposes. We have clearly lost this war." At that time, Japan was really far behind in terms of atomic energy. As an engineer, Morita realized that atomic energy was not something trivial, and that Japan was technologically behind and crawling behind all other countries like a turtle. Although the Japanese had already started inventing cool technology and hoped to change the course of the war, it was already too late. The Americans had crushed them. Morita was obsessed with all sorts of cleverly designed equipment since he was young. He was very surprised when he found out that his friend of the same age suddenly built a radio himself. It seemed like a miracle to him, like anyone could create such an amazing invention in their own apartment. At that time, amateur radio was becoming popular. Everyone was sitting in their homes and tinkering with something. Morita also got infected with this trend, so much so that he was almost expelled from school. When he was studying at university, the Second World War suddenly broke out, and the whole country went to war, but Morita did not fight. Instead, he conducted various ingenious research for the military. It was there that he met a super genius electronics engineer, Masaru Ibuka. This Ibuka was a super scientist who could do anything. They immediately became close friends. When the war ended, the buddies went back to their homes, Morita to Kosugai and Ibuka to Tokyo. Ibuka immediately started a new business in an empty building where only 7 people worked at first. Tokyo at that time looked like ruins, as in post-apocalyptic movies about the end of the world. Ibuka had almost no money, and in order to scrape some up to have enough to eat and not starve, he sold voltmeters, rice cookers, and electric heating pads. They were ready to sell anything just to make some money for a bowl of rice. Ibuka did not have a goal of creating some primitive electric heating pads. His idea was to sell something completely new, but he did not know what exactly. It turned out that after the war, the Japanese people were thirsty for all kinds of news from around the world, and there was a strong interest in listening to radio broadcasts. Americans at that time were very interestingly broadcasting on radio about how mighty and great they were and how beautifully they lived. However, they were broadcasting on short waves, and Japanese radios could not receive them. So Ibuka created an attachment that solved this problem. This product sold like hotcakes. This attracted public attention and was even written about in the press. Morita saw one of these newspapers and immediately recognized his old friend. He wrote him a letter saying that he was eager to help in the new venture. Ibuka responded, "Sure, come on over and we'll do business together. We'll make some cabbage." When Morita arrived in Tokyo, he saw their office in an almost completely burned-down building. It was really a sad sight. But all the workers were glowing with enthusiasm. They were glad they could work now, even though their city was in hell yesterday. And slowly they raised money, gradually conceiving a plan to produce something super grandiose, modern, and incredible. Business is in full swing. And then they came with Ibuka to ask permission from Morita's father, who had a family business producing sake. The thing is, in Japan, taking the eldest son is not just any small matter. Both sides usually give various informal commitments of sincerity, like the person devoting their entire life to it. Morita was raised as the heir of a company that had been brewing sake for 300 years, so it was even more significant. Ibuka told him that they had started a new enterprise and shared their grand plans, and that Morita was absolutely essential to them. He's a genius. But Morita's father didn't even object and gave the green light, saying, "Do what you want, son." They returned to Tokyo and founded the new company, Tosho. They all pooled their money and scraped together about $500. Of course, this laughable sum was not enough for anything. Most of the money in the country was frozen to combat inflation, so the banks refused to lend. Therefore, Morita often begged for money from his wealthy father, who in turn grabbed a share of the company. Americans were heavily involved in propaganda at the time, but the Japanese didn't have modern technology for this sweet propaganda to flow into their ears. That's why Ibuka and Morita created a mixer for them for radio broadcasting and received an order from the U.S. Armed Forces. At the time of the deal, in one of Ibuka's offices, he suddenly saw a Wilcox Gay tape recorder made in America, and he immediately realized that this device had a future and would revolutionize the entire industry. At that time, American cool music had just appeared, which everyone was crazy about and wanted to dance to. The idea of creating a tape recorder inspired Ibuka and Morita. Only they had no idea how to make this magnetic tape. No one in Japan knew anything about it, no one produced anything like it, and such a phonograph was rare even in America. They needed to learn somehow, but they didn't have plastic, only cellophane. But even the strongest types of cellophane quickly stretched and distorted the sound. They even hired chemists who scratched their heads for a long time but couldn't come up with anything. Then they decided to try using thick craft paper. Now it seems incredible, but back in those years they were cutting this paper with a razor blade and gluing it into strips with their own hands. And they were frying some salt on a skillet to get that magnetic powder, which they mixed with lacquer and applied to the tape. The device was extremely primitive, and the sound quality was terrible, simply awful, but they were proud of their creation. In 1947, a young musician named Norio Oga became interested in these tape recorders. He asked so many bold questions to the sellers that they invited him to talk to the engineers. Morita just loved all the young and daring people, as they give fresh ideas and the opportunity to look at all problems from a new perspective. So Morita tried his best to lure him to work for him, doing everything he could, but Oga refused, although he agreed to simply consult. And as a free overseer, he constantly helped improve the sound quality. At first, Ibuka thought he was just another silly and daring schoolboy. But then he somehow realized that Oga was actually a handsome guy, and with his knowledge, he could outdo any engineer. The tape recorder created in 1950 was very bulky and heavy, the size of a box, and weighed a whopping 35 kilograms, but it worked great. Everyone believed that as soon as people saw this super tape recorder, they would immediately clear the shelves, and customers would line up. However, in reality, no one wanted to buy it, as no one knew what this miraculous device was for. Besides, the tape recorder cost a whopping 170,000 yen. It was overpriced, and they made a total of 50 of these tape recorders. They were complete failures in sales, and Ibuka believed that creating something good was the main thing, and sales would follow. But that wasn't the case. There simply wasn't a market for it, and even in America, tape recorders were not that popular at the time. Morita showed his modern tape recorder everywhere, but all his attempts were unsuccessful. Morita thought there was no doubt that the tape recorder was a very profitable purchase. How to understand this? And then suddenly, he realized that he shouldn't sell tape recorders to everyone. He needed to find a specific target audience. They noticed that there was a shortage of stenographers in courtrooms. Thanks to his connections, Morita demonstrated this tape recorder, G-type, with voice recording function in the Supreme Court and sold 20 tape recorders in an instant. After that, they ran to the schools with joy. Ibuka found out that schools had money and needed such devices. They even designed a smaller tape recorder specifically for schools, H-type. with a luxurious industrial design in a briefcase-sized case. Orders from schools poured in, and the tape recorder quickly penetrated the school market throughout the country. They thought they had hit the jackpot. But one day, Morita noticed that tape recorder sales were not stable. They were either selling like hotcakes, or there was suddenly silence. What was going on? The small Totuko could still go bankrupt at any moment due to any market fluctuation. And he realized that they needed to go beyond Japan's borders. It was better to depend on the whole world than on just one country. In 1952, Ibuka rushed to America to get a feel for how Americans use tape recorders and to see their production. However, he was not allowed to see their production. Ultimately, the trip disappointed him except for one moment when he learned about a new mysterious invention called the transistor. Western Electric offered patents for anyone interested in buying them. Ibuka was intrigued because his company had a whole bunch of talented engineers who were itching to create something new. However, Ibuka ran out of money for the trip and had to return to Japan, missing out on the chance to visit Western Electric. When Ibuka returned to Japan, he continued to rub his hands together, hoping to acquire a license for this interesting thing. Although they didn't even fully understand why they needed this unclear transistor, they used it only in hearing aids at the time. But most importantly, they were inspired by the fact that it was something super modern and new. And that's important. At that time, they were all crazy about scientific progress and studied everything new like addicts. There was no response from Western Electric, but soon they were finally able to reach them through acquaintances, and they finally agreed to sell the transistor patent. In 1953, Morita went to New York to sign the agreement. For the first time in America, he was amazed by the size of the country and its modernity. He thought that this country didn't need anything, that everything was already theirs. He believed that it was impossible to sell their insignificant Japanese goods in this super great country. He was so surprised that he was not himself and even began to lose confidence. How could he negotiate with such a large organization when they were still such small-time players? Morita was a walking complex, and he was extremely nervous. At the last moment, he even wanted to turn around and leave, but his friend yelled at him, "Don't chicken out, brother! You can do it! Come on!" And in the end, the deal was successful. But now they had to persuade the Japanese Ministry of Trade and Industry to buy the patent. Naturally, they immediately resisted, saying, "Why do you need this transistor? You're so small you won't be able to produce such a complicated thing. Besides, there was no currency in the country to pay for this expensive patent." But Ibuka continued to persuade them. He persuaded them for a long time, about 6 months. And finally, they were able to buy the patent for $25,000. It was clear even to a hedgehog that they immediately started producing transistor radios. Although it was a huge risk because no one believed in them at the time, there were no transistor devices in the world yet, and they were also very expensive. But Totsuka believed that it would be a big revolution. At that time, there was a trend for high-precision sound, and people paid attention to the frequency of the sound. They showed off who had better speakers. Acoustic systems were getting bigger, and the sound was getting louder. However, ancient radio tubes were still used in amplifiers, which heated up, were bulky, and quickly broke down. Transistors, on the other hand, provided a cleaner sound, rarely wore out, and never overheated. Plus, they were very small, and the Japanese loved all things compact and precise. They abandoned tube radios as any peasant could make them. But before they could make a radio, they had to create their own high-frequency power transistor. And for that, they needed special equipment, which was very expensive. But they didn't have the money. So they went to Mitsui Bank again to beg for money, but the bank was extremely skeptical, saying that transistors were just a temporary solution until there was a shortage of tubes in the country. No matter how much they explained, it was like talking to a wall. Even Americans laughed at the idea back then. In the end, Ibuka went to the bank himself to explain to these stubborn people what was so special about transistors. He convinced them after talking to them for 3 hours, giving them a very unusual speech. Any action is accompanied by friction. Friction wears out the material. This wear and tear causes breakdowns, but there is no friction in a transistor, so it is super reliable. After such an extremely reasonable speech, they finally agreed. After some time, they finally put together a transistor using the phosphor coating method. In essence, they had to reinvent the transistor. And in 1955, the first transistor radio TR-55 was ready. While the people in the USA were rich and advanced, Morita went to New York to offer his favorite radio receiver to American wholesalers. But before that, he decided to rename the brand. After all, Americans would have twisted their tongues over such a complex name, and this nonsense would have greatly hindered marketing in America, leaving no chances. Instead of Totsuko, they chose the name Sony, because the Latin word sonus meant sound, and they were crazy about music and business was closely related to sound. And in those days, the phrase "Sonny boys" meant smart guys, and they considered themselves as such. And everything in this word is perfect, optimistic, short, memorable, and pronounced the same in any language. In short, you couldn't have come up with a better name. But Mitsui Bank was against the new name, saying that they had spent 10 years on the Totsuko brand, and now everything was going down the drain with this stupid new name. Many employees were also outraged, and Morita told everyone, "Don't be arrogant, guys, just wait a little and everything will be fine." And he took off for America. In America, Morita rented a room in some lousy hotel where only bums and beggars lived, and he, like a surfer dude, ate in all sorts of snack machines and pauper cafeterias, not hiding it at all. He wandered around the city, offering traders his miraculous device. But on many of them, the radio receiver did not impress them, saying, "Why are you making such small receivers? Here in America, everyone wants big ones. We all have huge houses. Why do we need such a microscopic one? We're not beggars. We're great Americans." To which Morita replied, "But each family member can close themselves in their own room and listen to their own radio receiver. Listen to whatever they want without bothering anyone. Isn't that cool?" In short, many Americans thought Morita was crazy. But there were those who somehow understood that this idea was good. One of these companies was Bulova. The product caught their attention, and they said they would buy 100,000 units. Morita was amazed. It was a huge order, several times higher than the cost of even Sony itself. There was no limit to his joy, but then they said they would put their logo on the receiver instead of Sony's. Of course, Morita refused this crap, as he had promised the guys to make Sony a big name not too long ago. Of course, Bulova didn't expect such a turn of events. Only a complete madman would refuse such a crazy deal. The person from Bulova wanted to persuade Morita, saying, "Your collective farm brand is not known to anyone, and what kind of silly name is Sony? Our name, on the other hand, is a widely known top solid brand." To which Morita replied, "Indeed, no one knows about us now, but nobody knew about you 50 years ago either." When Morita went back to the US 2 years later, his friends yelled at him for not behaving properly, like a bum eating in vending machine cafes and staying in cheap hotels. They believed that as Japanese, they should not humiliate themselves and should instead demonstrate high status. They suggested that it was better to rent the cheapest room in an expensive hotel than the most expensive room in a cheap one. Morita started eating in good restaurants and even learned the value of food and service. He also changed his rural appearance to a sophisticated and refined one. He even began to attend performances. Morita continued his search, and in 1957 he finally found an American dealer who was interested in buying radios. He had a network of 150 stores, and surprisingly, he did not have the stupid requirement to change the name. He was even willing to order up to 100,000 radios each year. This was a gift from above for Sony. However, Morita objected and said that 100,000 was too much. They only needed 10,000 and even cheaper. When the dealer heard this, his jaw dropped as usually. The smaller the order, the higher the price. It didn't make sense. For 30 years, no one had ever come up with such strange conditions. But Morita explained to him that his company had just recently moved from a hut to a normal building, and they couldn't produce more than 10,000 per month. Otherwise, they would have to hire a whole new batch of workers and expand their production capacity. And of course, it would require a lot of money. What if they suddenly stopped ordering radios in such large quantities? Then the whole business would quickly turn into nothing. The workers would have nothing to be paid, and was it worth taking such a huge risk if they would only place one order? Upon hearing all of this, the dealer understood the Japanese multi-step thinking and agreed to buy only 10,000 radios at a lower price. And finally, the radios entered the American market, and consumers liked them. Many moons ago, the great company known as Sony registered its name in 170 lands and territories for fear that it might be stolen by deceitful hands. Yet, on a day like any other, the people of Sony discovered that someone in their own land, Japan, had begun selling chocolate bars under the name of Sony. They even copied the shape of the letters. The people thought that Sony was in financial trouble if it had come to this. The company's reputation was defiled. The team had put their hearts into earning the trust of the people, yet some cunning creatures had brazenly stolen and taken advantage of their name. The case dragged on in court for nearly 4 years. These rats claimed that anyone could have come up with such a name, as if it were a common good. But no matter which dictionary they looked in, they could not find the word Sony. In the end, their lawyers were humiliated, and the name was taken back. The musician Norio Oga always criticized Sony, not holding back in his words. One day he said to Morita, "Your company has too many engineers, and the company itself is old-fashioned and poorly managed." Hearing this was very unexpected for Morita, as he thought his company was bold and original, where everything was perfect. Morita shouted, "Well, come to us then and shake up all us old rusty farts." But Oga replied, "No. As an artist, I need creative freedom, and I can't sit at a desk like everyone else." Then Morita secretly sent his wife to meet with Oga's wife, and in the end, they managed to persuade him to come work for Sony. And as soon as he arrived, he made a bunch of non-standard decisions, and in his first year of work, he even managed to lure 40 people from other companies. Once Ibuka realized that the days of radio were over, and the future belonged to television, Sony began developing a transistor television after their success with radio receivers. When they rolled out the TV 8301 model, Sony received worldwide recognition in 1960. Everyone was impressed, but it didn't really help their sales. The TV 8301 was too expensive, not in color, frequently broke down, and televisions were generally considered luxury items at the time, purchased only by the wealthy or eccentric. As Sony's name became more well-known, the Delmonico retail chain began to care less about quality and more about low prices. In pursuit of profit, they insisted on using cheaper materials just to lower the price. Morita, on the other hand, always believed in doing everything with a focus on quality. Additionally, they refused to sell unfamiliar products. This sleazy practice, of course, did not sit well with Morita, and it happened repeatedly, but he swallowed it all like a martyr. And when they rolled out this first transistor television, Delmonico started advertising it without permission, even though their contract didn't mention televisions at all, since they had only been making them for a month. Morita was worried, sensing that if he didn't sever ties with these idiots, a catastrophe would occur. Otherwise, they would sell super cool TVs for cheap, and top-class goods can't be sold for peanuts, so he sent them to hell. Delmonico resisted brazenly, and it even came to the point where it smelled like a lawsuit. They demanded compensation. Morita resisted in every way he could, but was eventually forced to pay them $75,000 to make them go away. From that moment on, Morita decided never to deal with those nasty distributors again. It was a very risky move, as they now had to create their own sales network, but this whole situation presented great opportunities. Morita realized that marketing is a form of communication. Usually, manufacturers stay far away from their customers and there is no communication between them. Plus, there is a long chain of shady wholesalers and intermediaries who don't care about your product. They have no interest or enthusiasm, so a monstrous gap forms between the manufacturer and the customer. For any primitive junk, this is normal, but if you have a super modern innovative product, this arrangement is not in your favor. Therefore, Morita began to build his own sales network, his own stores and supply routes. In 1960, he opened a demonstration showroom in the Ginza district of Tokyo where the public could familiarize themselves with Sony products. It was the most expensive property in Tokyo and was built as an ultra-modern building. Morita spent countless sleepless nights designing it. This store suddenly became very popular. A similar store was opened in New York. Morita spent 2 years searching for a location and ultimately found one on Fifth Avenue. The store opened in 1962, just before the launch of the mini television, as it was frequented by wealthy people who could afford Sony's expensive products. On opening day, 7,000 people visited the store to see the revolutionary TV. Mini TVs were a sensation in the United States at the time, and Sony couldn't keep up with demand. This tiny store in New York was supposed to be a springboard for entering the global market. Sony gradually entered many countries, and wherever they went, sales immediately increased because salespeople personally explained all the advantages of Sony products. For example, as soon as they ended their relationship with a mediator in England, sales immediately tripled. The Germans were also leaders in electronics and considered only their own technology unsurpassed, so initially Sony products sold poorly there. But even there, as soon as they got rid of incompetent distributors, sales volume immediately increased several times. The popularity of the demonstration showrooms in Tokyo and New York convinced Morita to build his own 8-story building in the Ginza district on one of the busiest intersections, which cost an astounding 3.2 billion yen at the time, equivalent to Sony's entire capital. Usually, Japanese businessmen, when they come to the USA, gravitate towards their Japanese compatriots. As a result, they only socialize in one group and limit themselves in knowledge. And then, even after years, they remain foreigners in America. But Morita, unlike them, went against the system, immersing himself in the thick of American society and learning about America from Americans themselves. Even at work, he rode the bus every day with regular New Yorkers, listening to their chatter and observing their habits like a spy. But even that wasn't enough for him. Gradually, he began to ponder more and more about the American way of life, and at some point decided to move to America to delve even deeper into the Americans, their way of life, their thinking, and all that. Otherwise, how do you sell something to someone you don't even know? And finally, in 1962, he moved to New York and even took his wife and children with him because for Americans, family is essentially the most important thing. Otherwise, you are not really American. And the thing is, no matter where you are, at a country club, a reception, or a weekend lunch, American families are always together. In Japan, on the other hand, men boast about being without their wives when they decide to talk over an important matter. They would never take their wives to a barbecue, but in America, it's the opposite. And the following year, Morita moved in with his family in a beautiful apartment on Fifth Avenue, where the great Russian violinist Nathan Milstein lived. Since he had gone to Paris for 2 years, his apartment was rented out for $1,200 a month. At that time, this amount seemed astronomical, but it was worth it. It was a stunning apartment with exquisite taste, with 12 rooms in the most prestigious area. It wasn't just an apartment, it was a fairy tale. Morita began to frequently organize parties once a week, and his circle of contacts quickly expanded with very useful contacts. And the study of this elite apartment became an electronics laboratory, where engineers studied competitors' televisions. The entire room was filled with televisions and various parts, and the Japanese were running back and forth. Sony was already a fairly large manufacturer of black and white TVs, but they had absolutely no experience with color ones. Meanwhile, competitors had long since raced ahead, and dealers were demanding color TVs. For several years, engineers struggled to create a color television. They couldn't get it right, and it wasn't until 1968 that they finally released the Trinitron color television onto the market. Competitors laughed at this invention, but this Trinitron turned out to be a super TV. It received a lot of respect because it produced an image that was 25% brighter than its competitors. And it worked reliably for 30 years. Some people even still have it in their homes. It was necessary to put an end to the dependence on borrowed funds from banks. Creating their own network required significant investments, and with empty pockets, one can't make ends meet, which became a serious headache. To solve this problem, it seemed like all they had to do was to simply enter the U.S. securities market. It's easy to say, but hard to do. You see, they had to simultaneously accommodate the Japanese Ministry of Finance and the American Securities and Exchange Commission. From Japan's side, the then Prime Minister was pushing for the development of international relations and convinced his conservative officials to do everything by the book. But with Americans, it was a major headache. It was very difficult for the Japanese to explain their business methods to them. The Securities and Exchange Commission caught the Japanese by the balls, making them do all sorts of bureaucratic things. But they were right. Sony's accounting was a complete mess. They didn't even know what horrors were going on with their reports. And when it was all over, the Japanese finally learned to balance the books and even rejoiced, realizing how cool this was and how they could have done it earlier. After a year and a half of hassle, they finally released 2 million shares on the American market in 1970 on the New York Stock Exchange. The shares were offered at $17.50 per share, and within an hour, 1 million shares were sold. After all this endless fuss, Morita had no more strength, but he was pleasantly surprised by a $4 million check from their first overseas stock offering. He had never seen such a large sum of money before and didn't leave his bed for 2 weeks. Sony became the first Japanese company to issue shares in America. Other Japanese companies saw all this and rushed to the stock exchange. In 1970, sales in the United States were increasing rapidly, and demand was also growing. However, it was not cost-effective to transport televisions across the vast Pacific Ocean from Japan to the U.S. Therefore, in 1971, Morita decided to build a factory in the U.S. to produce Trinitron televisions. In terms of costs and exchange rates of 360 yen per dollar, building the factory seemed unjustifiably expensive. American companies were actually moving their production overseas, such as to China. However, Morita believed that it was better for Sony to move in the opposite direction, as their market was in the U.S. At that time, Sony faced an anti-dumping lawsuit, which involved Japanese color televisions. As Sony's products always carried high prices, this lawsuit was odd. How could a company be accused of dumping when it had the highest prices? These lawsuits kept coming, as American companies wanted to block Japanese imports and constantly complained to the government. Japan was labeled as an economic animal, and President Nixon even imposed tariffs on all types of imports, making things more difficult. Therefore, against this backdrop, the San Diego factory became very profitable. Later, they built factories in Barcelona and Stuttgart, and in many other places, so much so that it was easier to count where they did not exist. And by the way, they did not exist in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was struggling to produce quality television sets and dreamed of partnering with the Japanese. In 1974, Morita was invited to the Soviet Union and shown how televisions were produced in Moscow and Leningrad. The Union planned to sell televisions in Europe and offered cooperation. Morita looked at everything and was stunned, shouting, "No one will buy such an ugly television anywhere! Why is it that in the Soviet Union, where art is at the highest level and performers are famous worldwide, it is not reflected in your television? Why don't you combine art and technology? I cannot accept that my products would be created in such conditions." So Morita declined. The Soviet Union was about 10 years behind Japan technologically, and poor quality and design were associated with worker indifference. No company can tolerate this, let alone imagine such a thing. When major radio stations in the U.S. suddenly began using video recordings, Sony realized that ordinary people would also want to record videos at home. So they began transforming bulky video cassette recorders into compact ones that people could easily take home. It seemed impossible to do at the time, but Ibuka suddenly gathered engineers, placed a small booklet on the table and said, "Hey guys, this is the size the cassette should be, and it should hold at least an hour-long program." Immediately, the engineers vigorously shook their buns in that direction. After some time, a completely new Betamax video system was born, which provided the best picture. This Betamax was truly revolutionary. Morita even came up with an advertising slogan, "A shift in time," meaning you could watch your favorite programs whenever you wanted. He proudly proclaimed that the era of video cassette recorders had arrived. In 1975, they planned to launch Betamax on the American market. However, nothing like this had ever been seen before in the world, so sales were meager, almost non-existent. Therefore, Morita decided to invest a huge amount of money in an advertising campaign, a grandiose, stunning campaign that captured the imagination of Americans so that people would finally understand the need for cassette recorders. Morita believed that television had completely enslaved the people. If you missed a program, you couldn't get it back, which meant that people had to change their daily schedules. Through this advertising campaign, Morita wanted to convey that from now on, the schedule was in the hands of the viewer, and now you could watch whenever you wanted. However, at the time, all power was in the hands of Harvey Schein, who ran all of Sony's operations in America. Although he was doing well, his approach was not Japanese. It was based on concrete logic and strict control. He did not want to spend so much money on advertising. This Harvey only thought 10 minutes ahead and did not consider the long-term returns and market coverage for the next 5 to 10 years. He only thought about how to squeeze all the juice out of the business right now, regardless of whether the business would suffer later. This is good if you are selling other people's junk, but if you are creating something that has never existed on the planet before, such an approach is not beneficial. In contrast to the Japanese, employee turnover is common for Americans, and that's why they think, why should I sacrifice my own profits now for someone who will replace me in a few years? This kind of thinking naturally shocked Morita, but they couldn't help but do what they were doing. Morita was worried, and at some point his patience ran out. He jumped out in the middle of the night, called this Harvey, and shouted, "Hey, you complete idiot! If you don't spend $2 million on advertising, I'll kick you to the curb." In 1976, Betamax advertising aired on 2 of America's most popular TV shows. However, with its release, television executives from Universal Studios, Walt Disney, and other TV companies were furious, saying, "Have you lost your minds, you damn Japanese, coming here with your cassettes? With these stupid cassettes, we will lose millions in lost licensing royalties." They immediately filed a lawsuit against Sony. It was essentially blatant illegal copying, copyright infringement, and it turned out that Sony had contributed to this without any shame. As a result, the sale of VCRs was under threat. It seemed that the good times were coming to an end. Morita told everyone that a VCR was just a harmless device that gave scheduling freedom, and the copyright law was written by some old farts when VCRs didn't even exist yet. The press was buzzing about it, defending Sony, as it was an incredibly stupid accusation. Morita was convinced that it was not even the court but the Congress that should settle this case by rewriting the obsolete and stupid laws. This was extremely difficult to do because the film studios had very close political ties and knew where to pull the strings. Sony believed that the best way to fight their political influence was to appeal to those who brought the politicians to power, the people. Therefore, they abruptly began a mass movement to draw attention to this issue among consumers, enlisted the services of lobbyists and lawyers, collected petitions, and so on. Sony was inundated with calls from the media. Morita traveled all over the states, actively pushing for public speeches so that everyone could hear his arguments. The film studios, in turn, also began to pull the blanket over themselves, enlisting the support of famous movie stars. The scale of the disaster grew sharply. As a result, it took 8 years for the legal disputes to end. Finally, in 1984, the court ruled that videotaping could not be considered a copyright infringement, and Sony won. However, due to the low compatibility and high cost of VCRs themselves, the Betamax format could not capture the market, giving way to JVC's VHS technology. At first, the industry was still divided into 2 camps, but gradually the VHS format took over. Betamax was a more advanced system and gave better picture quality. However, this wonderful picture was visible only on expensive, high-quality TVs, which were not available to ordinary people. In addition, 2 hours of video could fit on VHS, while Betamax could only fit 1 hour. No movie would fit. As a result, the VHS format monopolized the market, and competitors began producing video recorders tailored to VHS, while Sony continued to stubbornly support their Beta. The highly profitable sales of Sony's video recorders in the 1970s and early 1980s soon dwindled, and ultimately became a burden. After this defeat, Morita's ego suffered greatly, as he had struggled so much with these Americans, and in the end, it was all for nothing. Once, Ibuka complained with a sad face that he wanted to listen to cool music, but he didn't want to carry around a massive tape recorder, TCD5, as big as a suitcase. Morita realized that this was a genius idea, that they should create a small portable player. At that time, young people in New York were carrying huge boom boxes right on their shoulders. It was clearly not easy or convenient for them, but the youth couldn't live without music. However, Morita's idea did not impress the designers at all. Even Ibuka started to protest that the idea was rubbish. Everyone suddenly seemed to know better. But unlike all of them, Morita relied not on strict logical reasoning, but on intuition and a sixth sense. And something told him that the portable player would really become a bomb. Morita shouted, "If we don't sell 100,000 players by the end of the year, I'll resign." All the employees were shocked. This was a very large order. Morita was, of course, bluffing, but everyone believed him and worked hard anyway. His strategy was not to ask people what they needed, but to create what they didn't even know they needed yet. To reduce the size of the device, they removed the recording function and the speaker from a regular tape recorder. When the player with headphones was ready a year later, all the friends who tried it were amazed at the incredible sound quality. Even the engineers were surprised by the clear sound because all the sound waves reached the ears without loss, unlike regular tape recorders, where much of the energy is wasted just shaking the walls. The team struggled for a long time to come up with a name, since the success of the product largely depends on its name. Since the player was intended for young people, they assigned the youngest employees to come up with a name. And since Superman was super popular in the movies at that time, they came up with a similar name, Walkman. Although sales specialists were not thrilled with the new strange device, and some even laughed at the stupid invention that didn't even have a recording function, Morita was full of enthusiasm and was endlessly amazed by this player. The first Walkman was released in 1979. The lack of a dictaphone naturally annoyed journalists, and as soon as they could, they criticized the device and mocked it in every way possible. So in the first month, there were very few sales, only 3,000 units. Therefore, Sony's marketers decided to act more aggressively. Instead of advertising on TV, they recruited various Japanese celebrities who were seen everywhere wearing Walkman headphones. Sony employees walked around busy areas and offered passers-by the chance to listen and appreciate the device, and clapping and embarrassed faces were instantly filled with delight. And eventually, rumors about a new strange device began to spread quickly among Tokyo's youth. The Wonder Gadget, for the first time in human history, allowed users to carry their soundtrack from home to suburban trains and city streets. With just one push of a button, the urban noise would be muted, and users could enjoy their music, rewinding their lives forward. The word-of-mouth marketing worked its magic, and in the following month, 27,000 units were sold. 7 months later, the number increased to 140,000, and at some point, everyone started buying the Walkman, not just the youth. The demand was so high that sellers, who initially criticized the new device, were now eager to get their hands on it. In 1980, the Walkman traveled to America, and in New York, it became ubiquitous. People loved to show off their gadgets on the streets, and suddenly, they all felt like they belonged to the same brotherhood. Sony was selling not just a player, but a lifestyle. In total, 500,000 players were sold in 1980, and in the following year, 6 million were sold. By the way, Morita hated the name Walkman. It suggested that the player was only for men and that women couldn't listen to it. But it was too late. The marketing campaign had already started, and the name had spread worldwide. Around the same time, there was a fitness boom. Millions of people started using the Walkman during their workouts, and instead of terrible music played in gyms, users could now listen to their favorite tunes. The Walkman also became a symbol of status. Only wealthy and cool people carried this player. Among them was Steve Jobs, who received a Walkman from Morita himself when Jobs was in Japan in the 1980s. Jobs later dissected the device to understand how it was made and dreamed of creating something similar that would change the world. The Walkman was a big success for Sony, as its technology was difficult to replicate. It took competitors 2 years to create decent alternatives. By that time, Sony had already sold 20 million players and the company's popularity soared. This was Morita's formula for success. The first one to market is the King of the Hill. Once, Og was invited to Philips, where he was shown a laserdisc that provided high-quality sound. They believed that this invention could completely replace vinyl records. However, people were already used to vinyl, and the discs seemed unfamiliar and incomprehensible to them. That's why Philips proposed that Sony join them in the development and promotion of this new format, as Sony was then a marketing virtuoso. OG was a musician, so he liked this idea. As a result, the compact disc format was born. However, other recording companies perceived the compact disc as a threat to their long-playing records. They treated OG as an enemy of the industry. They had invested a lot of time in developing vinyl records, and now they had to rebuild all their factories. But Sony didn't care, as Sony also owned its own world-famous recording studio. In 1982, the world's first CD player, the CDP-101, was released, and music was sold on discs. It was a dream come true for music lovers, as discs hardly wear out, unlike vinyl records. At first, everything went well, with 1,000 players sold at the start, but the hype quickly subsided, and there was silence on the market for a whole year. It turned out that many people were still satisfied with their old records. A revolutionary player was needed to listen to all these discs. That's why they created the portable D50 player, the size of a disc box. This player caused a huge sensation in the audio world. Morita made this player obscenely cheap, saying that it didn't matter if they initially went into debt because everyone would eventually jump on board, and they would make a good profit. As a result, the player sold very well, and after a year and a half, it became profitable. Along with this popularity, the CD market finally began to take shape. Many musicians began to release their work on discs, and by 1986, disc production had increased to 45 million per year, far surpassing vinyl records. By 1992, it had reached 300 million per year. In 1989, Morita purchased the old and well-respected Columbia Pictures Studio for $3.4 billion, which owned the rights to many legendary films. Morita believed that if Sony had owned the studio earlier, they wouldn't have lost the war with VCRs. After this purchase, Americans became nervous, claiming that Japan was invading Hollywood. Morita responded to Americans by saying, "Well, if you didn't want to sell it, you shouldn't have." But then he calmed down, promising not to interfere in the affairs of the studio, even if they criticized the Japanese emperor in their films. As a result, he gave complete freedom to the managers, who extravagantly spent money and produced a series of failed films. As a result, all of this turned into a disappointing fiasco, as Sony suffered continuous losses in Hollywood, amounting to $3.2 billion in 1994. After this, Morita stepped down as chairman. He had suffered a brain hemorrhage and was no longer able to manage the company's affairs, although he continued to wield immense power over the company. At the time, Oga was running the company. The economic downturn and the weakening yen led Sony into crisis in 1993. The debt was sky high, so Oga carried out a radical restructuring in 1994, dividing the company into several smaller ones. Thus, the company within a company system emerged. Separate companies became fully independent, each individually calculating its profits and losses. At the same time, each of these companies had its own president with unprecedented powers. As a result, autonomy reached unprecedented levels. Oga's role was to oversee the entire business empire. In the 90s, cassette tape players began to lose their popularity, and the market was flooded with cheap Chinese analogs. It didn't take long for the music to stop, and at the end of 1993, Sony suffered its first losses of more than $200 million. In 1994, the MP3 format replaced cassettes and discs. But instead of using MP3, Sony created its own mini-disc format. At that time, all players began to support MP3. But Sony saw it as a threat to the industry because it was mostly used by pirates who violated copyright. And Sony had its own recording studio, Sony Music. Therefore, the use of the MP3 format was out of the question. The company was hindered by the mentality of not invented by us, a kind of syndrome of not accepting other people's developments. Everyone had to do it themselves. Instead of using someone else's, Sony constantly reinvented the wheel, not realizing that it was dragging its users into anal slavery with non-standard cables, files, and programs. For example, to download a track to a Walkman, you had to convert it back and forth every time. It seemed that Sony had lost touch with reality and sincerely believed that the only thing a player needed to provide to the consumer was reliable copyright protection. Customers didn't like this mockery, and they even returned their players to stores. As it turned out, the company was suffocating from within itself. As the world shifted towards digital technology, Walkman and Trinitron began losing their positions. Sony milked the Trinitron technology for so long that it began causing compatibility issues. Sony found it difficult to let go of what had brought it success in the past. Past success became a barrier to future success. In fact, after this, Sony stagnated for almost a decade. It wasn't that they lacked brilliant engineers, but rather the management of these engineers. Time was changing, but Sony continued to act as if it were a legend of the distant past, believing that it could continue to develop innovative products and throw them onto the market at high prices. Oga wanted to give the company oxygen, but ended up complicating things even more. After contemplating his 12 years as president for a long time, he decided it was time for him to leave, and in 1995 he chose Nobuyuki Ide as his successor. Many of the leaders did not like Nobuyuki Ide as the president. Not at all. They considered him ineffective, not an engineer, and lacking the charisma of Morita. Even the engineers did not like him, but they did not express open protest. When Ide took the helm, he declared that the company would soon experience a revival. At first, Sony did not really enter the personal computer market, but the demand for computers was constantly increasing. Mr. Ide decided to create a computer that would be focused on entertainment, that is, audio and video. Like everyone else in those years, he was fascinated by dot-coms, when everyone was betting on the internet and digital technologies. Ide even came up with a special phrase for this: children of digital dreams. Soon, the VIO laptop appeared, designed specifically for audio and video work, which was expected to become the most important channel for content distribution and revolutionize the personal computer market. To be fully prepared for the era of digital broadcasting, Sony even converted its vast collections of music, movies, and television shows into digital format. They created websites for downloading all of this content. And when the ultralight and super-thin Sony VAIO laptop with an original design appeared on the market in 1997, it was perceived as another hit from Sony and enjoyed good popularity. The VAIOs were really cool, with their design, battery life, and even better quality than Macs. However, despite all these titanic efforts, Nobuyuki Ide's venture never materialized. The market share of computers never exceeded a miserable 3%. VAIO laptops had one fatal flaw. They were exorbitantly expensive and were popular only in the business segment. Sony engineers went everywhere and talked about a bright future, but it never came. The company was stuck between a past that no longer existed and a future that had not yet arrived. The hype then revolved around Apple, which captured 90% of the laptop market. And when the dot-com bubble suddenly burst with a bang, Ide's plans finally failed. Employees could no longer stand it and openly criticized him for destroying Sony's former glory. Norio Oga ran around and shouted at him on every corner, blaming him for all the sins. Chaos engulfed the company. People lost faith in Ide and gradually stopped listening to him. When Morita was around, he could resolve any disputes, influence the heads of departments, and basically had the power to influence anyone. In the company, he was considered almost a god. Ide, on the other hand, was a different story. He tried not to interfere with the work of individual companies. As a result of that restructuring, departments could not communicate with each other properly, and there was chaos in the organizational structure. No one could understand anything, no one could influence anyone, and the corporation turned into a bureaucratic turtle. The invited directors were short-sighted and did not understand the business, and instead of innovation, the department sought short-term profits. Engineers were demoralized. Since the departments were separate companies, when one department asked for help from another, the other expected to be paid for it. In short, the level of idiocy cannot even be described in words. Independent divisions quickly turned into organizational chaos, and very soon, the unchanging VAIO bored consumers and turned into another product imitator. Sony also had high hopes for its players, but they didn't really succeed. In 1999, they released two players at once, Walkman with a memory card, memory stick, and the second Vaio, music clip, with a built-in music collection. Both players received poor ratings from critics. It turned out that these players were developed by two different divisions completely isolated from each other. As a result, they got two devices, both of which were worse than the iPod, which came out in 2001. The iPod was better in everything. It had an amazing interface, a built-in battery, worked on a hard drive, and easily played those same MP3 files. And Sony was left behind, unable to answer anything. All attempts were late, unsuccessful, and expensive. And Sony's market share in the player market always hovered around a dismal 5%, while Apple, with the iPod, captured a whopping 60% of the market. After the release of the iPod in the Japanese market, Apple put up posters in the country's suburban trains with the words, "Goodbye MD." Sony had everything to topple the iPod, but they couldn't do it because there was no unity among the divisions. And in Apple, there were no idiotic departments at all. Everyone worked as a cohesive whole. By the way, in Sony, engineers were considered the top tier, while programmers were not valued at all and were at the bottom of the hierarchy. Engineers worked on the product first, and only then were programmers involved. In 2001, Sony jointly released a phone with Ericsson that had a color screen, the ability to listen to music and take photos, none of which were available on competitors' phones, so their share of the global market reached 9%. But then smartphones quickly turned from simple phones into complex computers, and Sony couldn't keep up with the competition. Losses began, sales inevitably fell, and market share fell to a dismal 2%. In 2004, Sony announced that it had suffered losses of $1 billion in just one quarter, which led to a panic sell-off of Sony shares, resulting in a 25% drop in share prices. Mr. Idei, who was still at the helm at the time, admitted that such terrible performance caught even him off guard. Sony produced attractive products, but they were made from the same components as other manufacturers. There was nothing innovative about them. Therefore, it is not surprising that players, cameras, and other novelties became banal consumer goods almost as soon as they appeared. In 2005, Idei resigned. The Japanese grew tired of their dull strategy, extreme bureaucracy, and, most importantly, super slow decision-making, especially their love for endlessly tedious conversations, which most Japanese top managers suffer from. The Japanese love to talk endlessly and have these super endless, mega-dull conversations, but most of the time they don't really say anything, and as a result, no one understands anything. Decisions are not made. How can you make a decision if you've been walking around in circles for half a day? They always postpone conclusions to the very end and, most importantly, do not speak. And if you find yourself at a Japanese meeting, you will simply die of boredom. And they shout that this is probably the cause of all our problems. So instead of Idei, an American, Howard Stringer, was put at the helm. Stringer recognized all the problems and restructured the entire company. He centralized the decision-making process. In short, he returned everything to the way it was. And in March 2008, they closed 11 factories and 10,000 employees were laid off. When Xperia was released in 2008, people called it a hybrid of a snake and a hedgehog, because customers were presented with a semi-smartphone, semi-gaming console. Taking advantage of the huge popularity of Sony's PSP gaming console, developers tried to revive interest in phones, but the device did not save the company. Everything was somehow slapdash. Slow performance, not the best display quality, software bugs and hardware deficiencies, together with high cost, resulted in the product's failure. Instead of simply focusing on one model like normal people, Sony inexplicably released countless similar models. And although Sony's products were 10 times more reliable than any other, for ordinary people, the low price was still more important. And in the end, they missed the market. It was really a tough time for Sony. Laptop batteries were exploding, causing millions of losses. Laptops were overheating and nearly 1 million devices had to be recalled. Then an earthquake hit, followed by a tsunami that caused power outages, disrupted supplies, and caused factories to shut down. As a result, Sony suffered losses of up to $3.2 billion. All of this happened against the backdrop of a constantly strengthening yen, making exports more difficult. Demand for LCD TVs also plummeted. In short, every year was worse than the previous one, and losses were incurred for 4 years in a row. The former CEO, Stringer, couldn't handle it all, and no one listened to him in the company. He couldn't manage such a huge corporation and left in 2012. Kazuo Hirai took his place. In order to save the hopelessly dying business, he sold off a large part of the real estate, including the expensive headquarters building in New York, closed several unprofitable divisions and factories, and laid off several thousand employees. As a result, Sony gradually began to crawl out of the hole, didn't die, and even experienced a rebirth. This was largely due to the legendary PlayStation console, by the way. In the 80s video game console market, Nintendo was the king of the hill. At Sony, there was a guy named Ken Kutaragi who was obsessed with games and loved consoles. But Sony never even thought about entering the console market. Norio Oga shouted that they were a serious company and that these were just children's toys. It wasn't serious. Just at that time, in 1991, discs began to appear instead of cartridges. Sony developed the Super Disk Drive for Nintendo's Super Famicom console, as well as the SPC 700 sound chip. The two companies combined their devices into a single console called the Nintendo PlayStation, which was supposed to support both discs and cartridges. But the president of Nintendo didn't like the slave-like conditions of the contract, under which Sony would control all rights to the CD technology and receive outrageous royalties from sales. Sony was being greedy. Because of this, Nintendo would lose serious money. And Nintendo secretly turned to Philips for CD technology, which Sony saw as a knife in the back. Just breaking off the relationship was one thing, but betrayal was unacceptable. Oga, hurt by Nintendo's super odious act, decided, despite all objections, to enter the gaming market to beat the crafty Nintendo. And he assigned Kutaragi to develop a new invention. Even after the establishment of a new PlayStation production division, many employees looked at the old Kutaragi with contempt because he was working on some games. People also thought that Sony had lost its mind, as there was a whole graveyard of companies trying to enter the entertainment industry at the time. For the console, a large-scale advertising campaign was launched that did not use hollow terms like focusing on the number of bits like others did. The PlayStation had a stunning design that used a combination of circles and squares, and the elements were kind of convex. Instead of cartridges, Sony had discs, and for the first time in games, you could save your progress with memory cards. The console was very fast, and most importantly, it could play 3D games, which seemed like magic at the time. So it's no wonder that as soon as the 32-bit PlayStation hit the market in 1994, its success was immediate. The console outperformed all competitors who were far behind due to hardware problems, high prices, poor marketing, and a limited number of games. But Sony had an insane amount of great games because they convinced many game developers to create games for their console. And after all, the main profit comes not from the consoles themselves, but from the games. As a result, the first Sony PlayStation sold 1 million units in just the first 6 months. And by 1996, they had sold 5 million consoles. Prior to the PlayStation, the world viewed consoles as if they were only for kids, and adults were ashamed to play them. The world laughed at the Japanese as if they were a sentimental people who played games all their lives, but Sony shattered that stereotype, and now adults around the world also passionately play games on consoles. When creating the PS2, Sony decided that the new console should last for 10 years, so they included top-notch hardware. But this top-notch hardware caused game developers a lot of headaches, forcing them to dig into old-school assembler code when the console was released in 2000. Therefore, for the first couple of years, there were not many games available. But when GTA 3 was released exclusively for the PlayStation 2 in 2001, most people bought the console just to play it. Later, other games caught up and things started to improve. And people also bought the console because engineers included a DVD player, so you could watch movies on it too. It was easier to buy a console with a DVD player than to buy a separate DVD player. As a result, by 2006, Sony had sold 100 million gaming consoles. After that, Sony realized that they could do whatever they wanted and everything would work out for them. And so, in the PlayStation 3, they put in a whopping $2 billion to create a new chip, like a supercomputer. Plus, they also included a very expensive Blu-ray in production. As a result, the console turned out to be too expensive. Clearly, people were angry. They asked, why the hell is the third Sony so expensive? Almost twice as expensive as the second one. To which Mr. Kutaragi replied, listen, people, stop grunting, work, make money, and then you can afford our super advanced console. But at that time, a cheaper Xbox appeared on the market, and as a result, the PlayStation 3 sold 10 times worse than the PlayStation 2. Fame alone was not enough. Moreover, the console turned out to be buggy, constantly freezing and loading with difficulty. There were not many exclusives, which was also a death sentence. After this disgrace, Kutaragi was kicked out of the company. In the fourth Sony, they didn't try to do anything too complicated and just made everything as simple and understandable as possible for developers. All competitors were clueless in 2013, so Sony surpassed all these competitors. In the first day of sales, 1 million PS4 consoles were sold for $399. It was a kind of redemption for the previous failure. The fifth PlayStation in 2022 became Sony's fastest-selling console. Now, this gaming direction brings in about half of Sony's profits. Everything else is just a little bit. In short, Sony realized where the money comes from and is now actively developing this direction. Despite all the ups and downs, Sony brand remains one of the most recognizable in the world, and people still have respect and admiration for the brand. The company owes much of its success to its corporate culture. From the very beginning, Ibuka refused to implement a system of total control over employees so that each person was not just free, but truly free, and enjoyed their work. And if anyone was to be monitored, it would not be the regular workers, but rather the managers, because they are the ones who can make mistakes for years without anyone noticing. For the sake of immediate results, they can show beautiful numbers, but in the process, ruin the entire business. Human resources departments also usually behave as if they are the great gods endowed with divine power, appointing people, kicking them out of their jobs, or turning them into worthless muscle bags at work. But in Sony, Morita made everyone equal from the very beginning. He did not want managers to consider themselves exclusively superior people, chosen by God to lead foolish people to miracles. At Sony, the boss's grunting did not matter at all. Employees act without waiting for any instructions, showing creativity. Sometimes you come across such a stupid boss that no matter what you suggest, he will reject it all, shutting up the initiative employee. And this crap usually cannot be bypassed. That is why Morita published a weekly newspaper within the company with all kinds of job vacancies. And this allowed the employee to move to another position without making a fuss. And after such a maneuver, it immediately became easy to identify lousy bosses and all kinds of toxic bullies that everyone runs from. In general, if a person sits and works in one place all their life, they will simply become dull over time. Therefore, change is not just possible. It is mandatory, a new position every 2 years. But if a person is bursting with enthusiasm, they can change even more often, so that they eventually find a job that they enjoy. After all, people work not only for money but for the atmosphere. Usually, all companies like to suck and lick the word cooperation, where supposedly everyone agrees with everyone. But in Sony, on the contrary, you can boldly state that you absolutely disagree, and that everyone has become dull, but your new idea is better. Your opinion can blow everyone's mind, but you have the full right to do so. Once, the chairman of the board, Mitsuzi Tadzima, was greatly upset upon hearing Morita's opinion. But Morita shamelessly continued to insist on his point, not even considering to back down for a moment. They argued and fought, and at some point Tadzima yelled out, "All right, Morita, we really have different views. I'm leaving, goodbye." To which Morita replied, "If we had the same views, then what's the point of having two identical people in one company?" Tadzima was stunned by this response, and in the end he decided to stay. By the way, Sony's corporate culture is very similar to Netflix, and in terms of creative freedom, only Netflix probably implements it 10 times better. They have only one thing different. They prefer to hire one super genius instead of 1,000 good people, not sparing astronomical amounts of money on their salary. This is already very non-standard. Watch the history of Netflix on my channel. It's probably 100 times more interesting than this.